the intrinsic vice of myth on board. Hayden White and John Scott emphasized that all historical writing is, I quote, necessarily presentist, constructivist, and political, and thus entails some particular connection between the past and the present, end of quote. An approach that has not been as enthusiastically embraced by all historians and still remains a source of dispute. The linguistic turn in postmodernist critique added to the quandary, indeed the crisis in historiography, by rejecting the correspondence theory of truth on the grounds that language is not a transparent medium which allows the world to be seen as it really is. Whereby, as Frank Ankersmith claims, the criteria of truth and falsehood do not apply to historical representations of the past. The result was, as one analyst put it, confusion and a debilitating polarization in historiography between those who accepted the postmodern implications for history and those who insisted upon the validity of the traditional understanding of doing history. It would, however, be misleading to assume that the problematization of the traditional opposition between history and myth sprang solely from the postmodernist critique. Many among those who continue to insist on the ontological difference between mythos and logos admit that they interpenetrate and cannot easily be extricated from one another. Thus, since the early 20th century at the very least, myth or invented tradition has tended to use the discourse of science. It invariably appeals to scientific data or authority for verification. More often than not, mythos takes logos materials and transforms them into a story that, in terms of logos, is untrue. Thus, myth often proceeds from some true propositions, such derived logically from apparently authentic sources, which, however, become distorted in the course of their transmission, with the result that the narrative in its final form no longer corresponds to actual past events. While negative myths, reversing the myths which a nation tells about itself, are often presented as the true and demythologized version of history. Thus, each mythical view is drawn to the use of legitimate, that is, expert language to validate itself. And if it succeeds, it sets itself up as a new enlightenment. From the side of the logos, the movement also seems to be directed towards some kind of convergence. History or science in the modern age tends to behave like a myth. It has become an uncritically accepted, self-affirming doxa, in other words, a myth. As Habermas put it in a discussion of the Enlightenment, the myth of purposeful rationality has turned into objective violence. So-called scientific history, William McNeill asserted in his above-quoted address to the American Historical Association, is itself no more than a recent example of a belief system based on unquestioned assumptions similar to those upheld by any other group. All such systems, the scientific included, are mythic. It is precisely this interpenetration which is brought out by the idea of myth history. There is yet another major area, partly overlapping with that dealing with truth and falsity, where the relationship between history and myth is central. This is the area concerning the functions of myth vis-à-vis those of history. If certain historical myths have been used to format hatred and aggression, does it follow from this that historical myths are always detrimental to human collectives and ought to be eliminated? Approached from this angle, the relatively trivial question about who and why uses myths transforms into the more, in my view, more intriguing and essential one: why so many people remain susceptible to myths? In this area, again, opinions split. The rationalists believe that they can and should explode the myths as they are, in order to liberate those who are misled by them and clear the ground for a truer, more rational, and factually more correct history. The functionalists, on the other hand, bracket the issue of veracity and probe into the social functions which these myths fulfill. Let me give an example closer to home, illustrative of this major divergence of opinion. In his celebrated book, Kosovo, A Short History, Noel Malcolm juxtaposes myth and proper history as opposites. In the preface to the book, he denies that his aim has been anti-Serbian. Instead, it has been anti-myth. All groups in the former Yugoslavia, including the Serbs, he maintains, will one day have to come properly to terms with their history. Other historians, however, express doubts that this is indeed the right way to come to terms with anything. Malcolm's definition of myth simply in terms of historical untruth, write the British historians Wendy Bracewell and Alex Grace-Francis, is not sufficient to understand, let alone prevent ongoing conflicts. It may even leave the door open for new myths to enter the scene. The question of Bosnia and Kosovo are not only ones of what really happened, but also ones of why different versions of the past continue to hold the meanings that they do, and of why such importance is attributed to these meanings. End of quote. A generation ago, many people studied history in order to learn from it with respect to the present and the future. Jürgen Kocher, the well-known German social historian, wrote recently. Nowadays, many people deal with history in order to find out where they come from and who they are. Memory has become a central concept and a major activity when it comes to relating the past and the present. End of quote. This is no doubt a momentous change, which is part and parcel of a broader cultural and social situation. Deconstructivists turn under the auspices of the new cultural history, while making historians more self-reflective and subtle, tended to substitute explanation of causes and conditions for understanding, that is, for reconstructing the meanings of past phenomena. Meanings here stands for not only those which a phenomenon of the past had for contemporaries, but also the meanings it has or may have for present historians and their audiences. Attention has thus shifted from scientific to hermeneutical questions. For example, what do historians actually do when they tell a story? How do they thereby participate in the creation of collective memories and identities? Concepts like heterology, social memory, or narrative construction of reality have moved to the front of historical research, so that today a completely different assertion dominates the historical profession. That in order to know who the Egyptians and all other barbarians really were, if we again evoke Herodotus' agenda, the historian must know who they thought they were, where they came from, and where they went. One of the ways, if not the way, to get this knowledge is to take their historical myths seriously. And here I come to the way some of these disputes have affected the situation in the Balkan historiographies. The general pressure towards rethinking the fundamental methods and sources of historical research along the lines described already had produced, during the decades after 1989, a deep cleavage among the Bulgarian and, I would assume, the Balkan historians generally. Between those for whom the legitimacy of dealing with, and especially teaching history, rests on its ability to cultivate national identity, and those for whom this legitimacy is closely linked with their ability to be self-reflective about the basic premises of their discipline and its methods. At the present day, this means a cleavage between the production of history in the latter sense and the production of memory, that is, of affective, emotional, but also active consciousness of collective identity, here and now, with respect to which the so-called globalization represents the kingdom of amnesia. The phenomenon is neither Bulgarian nor Balkan, as the above quoted observation by Jürgen Kocher indicates. Since the 1980s, history has become more important as a source of collective identity than as a medium that showed the changeability of the world. The trajectories of the two groups of historians diverge radically, sometimes, especially during history wars of the kind Iridianova was yesterday describing around the Batak affair, with dramatic effect. Under normal conditions, they coexist in parallel with barely any dialogue or crossings. These are not two kinds of past, but two approaches to the past, which, however, produce different pasts. The central question which this situation brings up is relative historiography capable to satisfy the all too obvious craving for what Otto Bauer once called the community of experience? That is, the craving for collective identity and memory in an increasingly cosmopolitan and thus ahistorical world. Does contemporary post-national history have the resources to respond to this need? This, in my view, is a crucial question. Giving a straightforward answer becomes even more difficult owing to the fact that side by side with academic histories, there exists a public historical sphere, or a sphere of public historical culture whose scope has been expanding unevenly after the Second World War and explosively during the last decades. I'm talking of the ongoing process of extreme democratization of the production of history and the huge increase in the corpus of non-academic or parahistorical